The country faces a huge challenge to build and upgrade critical infrastructure. Earlier this month, the government responded to the Infrastructure Commission's report, suggesting how it be done. And I'm joined by Infrastructure Minister Grant Robertson. You largely, in your response, agreed with most of what the Commission had suggested, and I think you said that you were doing much of it, but what are the critical areas that you really need to address over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think the first one is the way in which our infrastructure plan lines up with our climate change plans, making sure that as we're deciding new infrastructure to be built, that it fits within that agenda of the emissions reduction plan, of making sure that we're thinking about issues of adaptation, which I think are going to become much more in focus, especially after the winter we've had this winter. So that's a really important part of it. I think the second element is around making better use of the infrastructure that we already have, and that is a big point that the Infrastructure Commission makes, is that there needs to be more investment, and we are investing more, but that actually won't be enough. We've actually got to do better with the infrastructure we have, so having better asset management plans, better design and procurement processes and so on within our existing budgets. So that would be the second thing. And then I think the third thing, and the really challenging bit, is the broader financing question. So how much of a role does the private sector have? How do we partner better with iwi, for example, in the development of infrastructure? And what are some of the financing tools that might back that up? And we've obviously got the IFF, the Innovative Funding and Financing Act, which we can do some work with, but there are other suggestions in the report that we're doing further work on as well.
Because there was some controversy over Transmission Gully and that particular vehicle. I mean, have you learned much from that about how you can...
I think a lot, and there's been at least 2 reviews of it, and PPPs, traditional public-private partnerships like the one at Transmission Gully, do have a place, I believe, in some parts of our infrastructure funding and potentially in roading, but they must be better designed and better managed than the one at Transmission Gully. And I do have a deep concern about the way in which those agreements we end up in a very, very vulnerable position as a government if we don't sign up to the right agreement at the beginning, and you just get continual cost escalations and claims against the government. And those sorts of PPPs are designed in many ways in favour of the private partner. If we're going to use them, we would be using them in a different and a better way than what I saw at Transmission Gully.
But how do you do it in a way? Because obviously the private partner has to be getting something out of it, otherwise they're not going to invest.
That's right, and it's not so much about that. That's because they can look at it with a very long-term return. What it is, though, is about the way the contract's structured, about where the government's liability starts and ends, and facing continual claims through the contract process and then beyond it even. I think that's about the design of the contract and what the government signs up people to. As it happens, we think that the government's got a greater role in funding our own contribution more. We don't believe in the use of PPPs in areas like health and education, where those are really core to the provision of social services. We've had experiences in corrections which point us to not really wanting to use them there. I prefer more of that partnership approach that's driven off a slightly different basis. So looking at what we're doing with the IFF approach, creation of those special purpose vehicles where you've got both council, central government and a private developer involved, shares the risk a bit better, gives a better long-term confidence to people, good for doing more integrated urban development type projects, and that's what we're doing in Tauranga. So I prefer that kind of approach to the pure PPP model that we saw at Transmission Gully.
I mean, one of the issues that came up there, and I wonder if it's a broader problem across all infrastructure, and that was, there was, I think, an argument that the price was driven too low, and then obviously the private sector and parties involved had to do things to try and make it more profitable for them. But if we look at schools, hospitals, is there a question at times, by going for the cheapest possible, we don't build it, we don't future-proof a lot of that infrastructure for growth? I mean, is that a big issue to deal with?
It absolutely is a very big issue for us to deal with. And if you talk to those who competed in the bid for Transmission Gully many years ago, they would say to you that they found it incredible that the government of the day agreed to the price, because they didn't think it was possible to build it for that And they were right. And so making sure that in our procurement processes we're much more sophisticated is very important. And actually in the infrastructure strategy, the Te Wāhanga, the Infrastructure Commission, actually talk about that and say that the government needs to be better at procurement, better at the business case and design process, better at the contracting. And so we're working with the Commission on how we do that. Our very large infrastructure agencies like Waka Kotahi or Kāinga Ora should have the capacity and basically do have the capacity to do that. Some of our smaller agencies find it harder, and we are trying to work with them so we can get more standardised practices. The Commission would have us go even further and draw local government into those more standardised practices. We're still doing our review of local government, so we're not ready to say yes to that yet. But the broader view that we need more standardisation and a higher quality in our procurement, I absolutely endorse.
What about, I mean, most infrastructure, it's long term, so it crosses governments of all stripes, but then you have contentious issues. If you look at Auckland Light Rail or even your reform of the three water structure. Now, both of which, if there was a change of government next year, could be scrapped. I mean, how do you deal with those sorts of...
Yeah, so the Commission has exhorted all of us in the strategy to come up with a priority list that's effectively independently agreed and that governments stick with. I'm certainly interested in how we can identify priority infrastructure that does transcend governments. But in the end, there will always be a political element of some sort. And I don't mean that in a party sense, but almost in a policy sense. So, for example, the fact that I believe our investments need to really prioritise climate change, public transport's a big part of that. Auckland Light Rail would seem to me to be a pretty important part of that in the Auckland region. So I think it's very hard to be able to say definitely every project will survive a change of government, but creating a list that is agreed as being the priorities for New Zealand is very important. And so we want to work on that. How that then translates across changes of government, I don't think we have the answer for yet.
And in that terms of priority, do you have priorities between, roads, rail, what you invest maybe on climate change resilience, schools, hospitals?
Yeah, so the emissions reduction plan really gives you that guidance. And if we just take the transport sector as an example, quite clearly, if we want to see us meet our emissions reductions goals, then we need mode shift. Now that means getting people out of internal combustion engine vehicles, but it doesn't mean the end of roads, because we still need roads for the electric vehicles, we still need roads for the hydrogen powered vehicles, for the public transport. But yes, we are looking to reorientate our investment around that climate agenda, and so therefore you'll see that process of decarbonising our transport fleet being backed up by the infrastructure decisions that we might make. I think the other point that the Infrastructure Commission makes, which is essential, is thinking more and more about integrated development projects. So Auckland Light Rail is not actually a transport project. It's an urban development project. Let's Get Wellington Moving here in Wellington will only work properly if the housing development matches the transport development. And so more and more being able to look at infrastructure projects that way, I think, is critical to be able to achieve that climate agenda as well.
The opposition repeatedly accuse you of not delivering on these sorts of projects. Are you satisfied with the progress being made?
I think I would say I'm satisfied that we've delivered some good and important infrastructure projects, but it is slower than I would like. COVID's had a big role to play in that, and everyone involved in construction or building would be able to tell you of the delays that have been experienced, the supply chain issues, the labour issues. We're affected by that as much as anybody else is. But I do want to see better and more efficient decision making and delivery, and we've been working closely with the agencies like, for example, Health, as we do the health reforms. Rather than have 20 DHBs building hospitals all with different design specifications, we can now have Health New Zealand managing that much more closely, and I think we'll get a more efficient delivery. So there's definitely room for improvement there.
Grant Robertson, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Brent.